There's breaking news about a mysterious case. The police found a body, listen closely, a dismembered body at a sewage treatment plant.
On that Monday morning, January 13th, 2025, Thalita Ramos did something very simple, ordinary, that all of us do here if we have the chance. She opened WhatsApp and sent a hi to her mom. There was nothing there that would make anyone suspicious of anything. No desperation, no cry for help, nothing. There was nothing to indicate that this would be the last time anyone in the family would have contact with Thalita. Thalita was 36 years old, she lived in Brasilia, was the mother of a teenage girl, and even as an adult she kept a habit that said a lot about who she was. She would tell her mother where she was, who she was with, and if she was okay. She had done this many times before, including 2 days earlier, when she said she was with a friend in the Guará neighborhood. Everything was going as usual. But after that, on that day, that Monday, there was silence. A silence that didn't last just hours, or a day, or two, but lasted 22 days. A period of time that, for bureaucracy, might seem like just another detail among so many others, but for Thalita's family, it hurt, didn't it? It was an agonizing eternity, full of questions, fear, guilt, and a feeling that something was very wrong. But before we really get into the details of this story, I wanted to ask you all for something. Listen to this episode until the end and put yourself, even if just for a few minutes, in the place of Thalita's family. Because what happened to her doesn't end with the violence of a crime. It continues with the decisions that came afterward, in the way those who should have handled things differently actually dealt with all of this. Marcos Campos. And here on the channel, every week there are at least 3 episodes of detailed criminal cases like this one, sometimes even more. So go ahead and turn on your notifications so you don't miss any episodes. If you can, become a member here on the channel, it helps me a lot. Announcements made, let's get to the facts, music. This case came to the channel through Rebecca Crisielli, a follower who also lives in the Federal District. And to understand everything that happened to Thalita, we need to start from the point where no one thought there was a crime, when Thalita stopped responding to messages, and the concern didn't arise immediately. She was an adult, had her own life, and, according to her own family, there was a delicate history, a point of concern that could make everything even more confusing. Thalita struggled with chemical dependency problems, and occasionally she used drugs. She had even been hospitalized at times in the past. That's important to mention here, okay? Not to judge, but because this information changes everything, doesn't it? There had been other times when Thalita went a few days without contact, but never like this. So, that much time, and above all, never without at least giving some news. Even so, in the first few days, the family tried to handle it in the most humane way possible. Calling friends, acquaintances, asking here and there, retracing, maybe mentally her last steps. That desperate routine, I would say, of someone trying to keep hope alive even when their heart is already heavy, But as the days went by, the absence started to weigh, and in a world where the cell phone has become an extension of the body, that silence was unsettling. That's when, on February 3rd, 2025, 22 days after the last contact, the family made the decision. It was even harder to officially report Thalita's disappearance. From that moment on, she was no longer just a daughter who didn't answer the phone and became officially a missing person. Missing. While Thalita's family was living through the anguish of her disappearance, the city of Brasilia went on with its normal routine until, on the morning of January 14th, 2025, something completely disrupted normalcy at a specific point in the capital. Employees at the sewage treatment station, Companhia de Saneamento Ambiental do Distrito Federal, located in the Vila Tela region of Brasilia, came across something that no one is ever prepared, I would say, to find on an ordinary workday. There were parts of a human body there was no doubt. That wasn't trash. It was either an animal or, to be more precise, actual pieces of a human body. The area was quickly sealed and the civil police of the Federal District were called. At that moment, no one knew who the victim was, But it was already clear that it hadn't been an accident. It was a crime, and a very violent one. The human remains were stuck there on the station system's grates brought by the flow of water. There were no documents, no visible identification. What was certain was that someone had been killed and that the body had been deliberately disposed of. The police then took over the case and began their work, which, besides being technical, is emotionally heavy. It's the attempt to identify those remains, to find out who that victim was. And cases like this rarely have a quick solution, do they? The investigator then called in a multidisciplinary task force, medical examiners, forensic anthropologists, odontologists, and the Forensic DNA Research Institute from the Federal District. All these professionals were working together, trying to find out who it was, who those remains belonged to. Bone fragments, dental arch, anthropological profile, genetic material. In addition, the police started using georeferencing data, trying to answer a basic question: where could the body have come from? During this period, the connection between that body and the disappearance of Thalita still didn't officially exist. For the investigators, it was an unidentified homicide, for now. For Thalita's family, it was a distressing disappearance. Still two parallel stories with no apparent connection. Meanwhile, the investigation into her disappearance continued its course. The civil police began to treat the case as a disappearance that could be either voluntary or the result of someone else's actions. A friend of Thalita was questioned, and he said that the last time he saw her, she had requested a ride through an app. And the destination given for that ride was Block Quadra Economica, 46 Guará 2. The police did the basic and necessary work, analyzed the app account, and tracked down the driver. According to him, during the ride, Thalita mentioned that a friend was supposed to pick her up at that location. Who was this friend? Why she never officially appeared in the investigation until today is not clear. Amid this work, one detail started to catch the police's attention. Vila Telebrasilia, where the body had been found, is about 12 kilometers from the ecological park. A park that, until then, hadn't appeared in any official report related to Thalita's disappearance. But that distance wasn't big enough to be ignored, was it? Days went by, then weeks, until two lines of investigation, which until then had been running in parallel as we've seen, started to come together. On one side, a dismembered body found at a sewage treatment plant, and on the other, a woman who had been missing for more than 20 days with no contact with her family. And little by little, the pieces started to fit together. The test took a long time, and for Thalita's family, each day that passed without an answer was another day trapped between two equally painful possibilities: fragile hope and growing fear. Meanwhile, back at the lab, the work continued. Experts analyzed bone fragments, compared dental arches, cross-checked genetic data, and reviewed georeferencing information. It was a meticulous technical puzzle with no room for error. Until finally, two investigations that had been moving separately finally came together. On one side, the dismembered body found in the sewage over at the sewage treatment plant. And on the other side, the missing person report for Thalita Marques filed by her family on February 3rd. When the data was compared, the confirmation came quickly. The body was hers. For Thalita's parents, that was the moment when any remaining hope died. After weeks living between fear and denial, they now had a certainty, the worst of all, right? According to the available information, after all the suffering, the family decided to cremate the body. But while the mourning was taking shape, the police investigation was entering another phase. Now, it was no longer about finding a missing person. It was about discovering who had done that. From the moment of identification, the pace of the investigation changed. Thalita had left traces, many traces, in fact digital traces. Footprints, location traces, and most importantly, traces of contact. The analysis of cell phones that were near hers on the day of the disappearance was decisive, as was the mapping of movements in specific areas of the city. Little by little then, the investigators began to narrow down the number of possibilities until they identified those responsible. The main suspect was a 36-year-old man, João Paulo Teixeira da Silva, known in the region as João Paulo. He lived in a squatter area in Guará 2 near the ecological park. Sometimes he worked as a car watchman, at other times he slept under the building, Consei in the same region. João Paulo was not a stranger to the police. He already had a criminal record and his history of violence was extensive. Extensive enough to raise an uncomfortable question. How was someone like that still free? But João Paulo was not alone in this. The investigation pointed to 2 more people involved. 2 teenagers, one 15 and the other 17 years old. The 3 of them then were together in drug trafficking in that area. And according to the investigators, it was exactly this criminal relationship that put Thalita in their path. At this point in the investigation, a lot of things were still not public. It was known that they were involved. It was known where they operated. But what still needed to be clarified was the hardest part, to narrate exactly what happened to Thalita on that January 13th. That reconstruction would only be possible later, and when it came, it revealed an unbelievable level of violence that shocked even the investigators on the case. Only after those responsible were identified was the police able to confidently reconstruct what happened on Monday, January 13th, 25. Until then, there were only fragments of information, scattered locations, phone records, and disconnected accounts. Now everything was starting to make sense. On that day, according to reports, Thalita was inside the ecological park, more specifically in an area of illegal occupation within the park in that neighborhood I mentioned. And according to the investigation, she had gone there to buy drugs. For those living in a situation of chemical vulnerability, guys, this kind of trip might seem like just another routine episode. It's not a quick meeting and exchange there, a deal, and then you go back home and everything's fine. But that day, that didn't happen. At the location, Thalita met 3 drug dealers who operated in that area, that 36-year-old guy and the 2 teenagers. The negotiation then started there suddenly like any other, but something got out of control. There was a disagreement supposedly related to the quality and payment of the drugs. Voices were raised, the argument escalated, and in that environment it's predictable what can happen, isn't it? In just a few minutes, the situation turned into extreme violence. According to the investigation reports, Thalita was brutally assaulted. She had signs of beating on her face and head, injuries caused by stones, blows, knife wounds, and she didn't have any chance to defend herself. The violence was quick, intense, and fatal. Thalita died right there, but unfortunately, that wasn't the end. In a clear attempt to cover up the homicide, the perpetrators decided to go even further. Thalita's body was dismembered, or rather butchered. Part of it was buried inside the park itself in a deep grave wrapped in a blanket. That pot would only be found weeks later on March 17th. The other fragments were discarded in a stream, a small creek that ran through the area. And, with the flow of that water, those remains ended up being carried to the sewage treatment plant. And was it like this? A day after Thalita's last contact with her mother, that parts of her body showed up there? Miles away from the place where she had been killed? None of that was accidental. Nothing was improvised in the heat of the moment. According to the investigation, all 3 people involved actively participated in every stage of the crime, from the assault to the concealment of the body. When the investigators finished the reconstruction, one thing was glaringly obvious. What was supposed to be a quick meeting there to buy drugs ended up becoming Thalita's death sentence. And look at how this case was built up, right? The body turned up there right after she disappeared, but the police still hadn't connected the dots with the solved crime. Regarding the perpetrators, the means, and the motivation, Thalita Marques Berquó Ramos's case entered what should, in theory, be the stage of the state's response, the judicial phase. João Paulo Teixeira da Silva, the adult involved in the crime, was arrested in March 25. He is charged with qualified homicide, concealment of a corpse, and corruption of minors, and the trial by the jury court was scheduled. Up until now, the script seems to be following the expected path, doesn't it? But there's a detail that makes all of this even more outrageous. 9 days after killing Thalita, João Paulo was the target of a preventive arrest warrant for an attempted murder committed in December 2024. In this previous crime, he and a 15-year-old teenager also followed the victim and fired gunshots hitting the man's arm. In other words, when Thalita was murdered, Juan Paulo should have already been in jail. He was only captured at the end of January. Too late, isn't it? The other two involved in the crime took a completely different path. They are not charged with homicide, not charged with concealment of a corpse, not charged with dismemberment. They are charged with an infraction analogous to these crimes. So, the other day I made a reel about the case of the little dog, right? Orelha? I invite you all to check it out on Instagram and read that post, which turned out really interesting. It talks about this kind of thing, you know? Unbelievable almost. In practice, what did that mean? Measures for these teenagers, socio-educational ones. The state doesn't see them as murderers. It sees them as young people in conflict with the law, and their destination isn't prison, it's a socio-educational institution. On paper, guys, the speech sounds really nice, right? Resocialization, education, reintegration, but in reality, what does that mean for us? It means that someone who took part in a brutal homicide, practically something that brings back barbarities from a very distant past. A brutal homicide, followed by dismemberment and concealment of the body. It means that they can serve their sentence in a place where there is a bed, fresh food, medical care, school, leisure, the impossibility of knowing who they are, and in some cases, authorized outings. And the story gets worse. It's October of last year, this 2025. The Second Court of Childhood and Youth of the Federal District granted a semi-liberty regime to one of these teenagers. The decision was signed by a judge who, according to the sentence, disregarded the aggravating factors of the homicide and understood that the act had occurred under the influence of violent emotion right after the unjust provocation by the victim. Yeah, read that again, guys. So, we need to be very careful here because some more impatient people might look at it like this. Oh, they went there looking for it, right? Because they were going to get drugs and all that. I'm not even going to argue because, you know, and the proportionality, that's what I mean, you know, like that. There's a conflict there. They're not the dealers of that crap. So there's a conflict between the guy who's buying and the person who's selling. You say, oh, you don't want it, go look for someone else, man, buy. But now it's like kill, escalate, kill, hit on the head, stab, then dismember, cut up, hide the body. She was an adult woman, she was alone, and she was in a complicated situation there, right? How was she supposed to defend herself against 3 grown men? And how can someone who's holding the pen consider this person as the one who provoked her own brutal death, the end that her body suffered? This teenager committed the crime at 17 years old, and after turning 18, he remained in the facility for minors and then received the benefit of semi-liberty. Semi-liberty means that he can go out to study, go out to work, move around the city, and live an almost normal life. Just like what happened with that guy from Brasilia, right? He got out on semi-open regime, enrolled in a college, look, that's really crazy, and almost killed another person, right? I forgot the bastard's name now anyway. While all this was happening, Thalita's family lives with a permanent absence, right? They already had too many problems and now they have this pain of grief. The Public Prosecutor's Office of the Federal District reported that it will appeal the decision that granted this semi-open regime. But until that happens, the damage is already done, right? And other people are at risk. For the parents, for the brother, the siblings, I should say, and also for the daughter. For Thalita, this decision is not just legal, it's moral. They claim that the sentence offends Thalita's memory, downplays the seriousness of the crime, and in practice acts as an incentive to criminal behavior. Because the message that remains is quite simple and I would say frightening. If you are a minor, even if you take part in a brutal homicide, the system will protect you. On January 13th, exactly 1 year after the crime, now at 26, the family organized a march for justice. It wasn't a political act, it wasn't a partisan protest, it was simply the cry of a grieving family. They asked that Juan Paulo be tried and convicted and demand that the other person involved, who is now already 18 years old, also be brought to a public trial. For them, there is no legal shortcut that can erase what was done. And here, I need to tell you, straight and to the point since you're listening. This teenager who took part in the murder did not have his name released, did not have his face shown, and his identity is protected by law. And he could be sitting right next to you on public transportation, who knows? He could walk past your house, go to the same church as you, study at the same school as your children, and you will never know. In the semi-liberty regime, the individual leaves the institution during the day and returns at night, right? There's a routine, there's structure, there's supervision. Meanwhile, Thalita didn't have the right to any of that. Her life was violently cut short, her body violated, her story reduced to a legal case. And here, out of absolute respect for the family, we are omitting details of what was done to Thalita's body. Okay, I only told the tip of the iceberg. But it's clear from the evidence and the reports that the barbarity was conscious, active, and collective. And even so, brushing over the crime, giving the minor a slap on the wrist, it's a collective feeling of abandonment. For those who watch all this from the outside, it's not for us as a society. There's a very troubling question that remains. What kind of law is this that protects those who destroy, but fails those who have been destroyed? We live in a reality where values seem to be reversed, where impunity becomes the rule, where, as many say, the tail wags the dog. What happened to Thalita is not an exception, it's part of a pattern that repeats itself in Brazil. Isn't that right, guys? For decades now, there's been a pattern where extreme crimes are committed by teenagers. And the system's response never matches the seriousness of what was done. In the early 2000s, the country came to a halt over a case involving a teenage couple who were victims of one of the main figures and one of the most savage cases in Brazil. The main perpetrator was also a minor. At the time, there was a lot of national commotion, protests, and promises of changes to the law. Despite many people, even in the face of such barbarity, finding words to try to justify anything, nothing changed there. The perpetrator was not tried as an adult, did not face a jury trial, and in the end, he was sent to a juvenile detention system. The state realized that he couldn't be released and came up with a maneuver to keep the guy under surveillance, a kind of improvised justice, you know? I think everyone knows which case I mean, right? There's also one more thing to mention. People, there's a conflict with this system of punishing young people who commit barbaric crimes. How are you going to demand a change in the law? If you have reservations here and there, the law will be applied according to the act. You can rest assured. This needs to be observed now, going back to Brasilia 2025. In Thalita's case, regardless of what you think is right or wrong, we have a homicide, extreme violence, concealment of a body, and active participation of teenagers. Even so, the response was the standard one: confidential proceedings, socio-educational measures, and in one of the cases, semi-liberty. And the message that remains, I repeat, is clear and dangerous. The idea still matters more than the act itself. Questioning this is not asking for revenge, it's asking for proportionality. Because for Thalita's family, the pain isn't theoretical, it's permanent. They don't discuss legal or psychosocial theories and so on. They live with the absence. That's why they took to the streets. That's why they asked for a trial. That's why they refuse to accept that a crime of such brutality is treated as just youthful excess. Those involved have their identities protected, their pasts are shielded, they return to society without anyone knowing who they are. Meanwhile, the family carries a grief that never goes away. Punishment is temporary, but loss is not. And maybe the biggest problem isn't the existence of laws, but their inability to deal with extreme crimes. Because when everything is treated the same, nothing is treated with the seriousness it deserves. And as long as cases like Thalita's keep being treated as isolated incidents, the pattern will remain unchanged. Remembering the name Thalita Marx Ramos is a way of refusing to stay silent. It's like making the dog pee on the post as it should be. Thanks for your company. Leave a comment. What do you think? Redhead kiss? See you next episode.